Commentary, City of Glass from the New York Trilogy by Paul Auster. Information, form and style of the book. Paul Auster's first, or second, long novel and his major debut novel originally published in 1985, and the first volume of the New York Trilogy. A 13-chaptered novel borrows the form of detective stories, and a snobbish postmodernist or avant-garde literature contains various elements and signs, many fine little episodes and mentions of classical literature, describes confusion, complexity, difficulties and emptiness of the contemporary huge metropolitan city, New York, and deconstructs the grand narrative, the significance and the form of traditional novels. Synopsis. The trigger is a wrong number. A mystery writer in NY, Daniel Quinn, accepted the case of Peter Stillman. As a private detective, Paul Auster, Virginia Stillman, the wife of Peter Stillman, requested him to watch the same-name father. Peter Stillman would discharge soon. The former professor of Columbia University wrote a book of extraordinary and occultist religious theory. He shut up his son in a room for 9 years. Quinn watched Stillman during 2 weeks, but he was wandering around a constant area of town only. Quinn tried to talk to Stillman, but his talkings were incoherent. A day, Stillman suddenly checked out of the hotel he stayed, so Quinn lost track of Stillman. Characters. Daniel Quinn, the main character of this story and a novelist, wrote mystery novels as the alias of William Wilson. 35-year-old man lost his son and wife, lived alone in a small apartment in the 107th Street, New York. Once, he had been written enthusiastically poetries, plays and critical essays, but he abandoned to write them 5 years before. Virginia Stillman, a client of Daniel Quinn as Paul Auster, Peter Stillman Jr.'s wife. Around 35, woman was a speech therapist of Peter Stillman Jr. for 5 years. Somehow, she passionately kissed Quinn. Peter Stillman Jr., a mysterious and confused young man from Old Boston, dressed entirely white with white blonde hair and had pale skin. He said his real name is Mr. Sad, Peter Rabbit, Mr. White and Mr. Green. He inherited his father's large amount of property. He was shut by a room 9 years in his childhood by his father. Peter Stillman Sr., his name is also Peter Stillman, same as his son. He was from good Boston Stillman family. He went to Harvard, studied philosophy and religion, and wrote a thesis on 16th and 17th century theological interpretations of the New World, then worked in the religion department at the Columbia University. Because of his wife passed away, and he left Columbia, shut himself in his house, and concentrated on and seriously believed his extraordinary religious theory and investigated God's language. The time Quinn watched him, he was a tall, thin, past 60-old man with uncombed white hair, wore a long brown overcoat and had a battered leather suitcase. Henry Dark, an imaginary clergyman in Boston, he was a secretary of Milton, then emigrated the New World and published a pamphlet, The New Babel, which justified the conquest of the New World by his philosophical idea and thought of language. He argued that if man could restore the original language of innocence, man would obtain the New World as the New Eden. Peter Stillman Sr. said Henry Dark is a fictional man in his book. A writer, Paul Auster, A tall, dark-haired and mid-30s writer lived in a well-kept apartment near the place Quinn lived, was writing an essay about Don Quixote. He was friendly and cooperative to Quinn, but Quinn was envious of him that he had things Quinn had lost, such as wife, son, intellectual writing and well-off life. Other characters are listed below. Places. Places appear on this novel are listed below. Key elements. New York, an inexhaustible, a labyrinth of endless steps. The city left Quinn with the feeling of being lost in the city, but lost within himself as well. It was the nowhere Quinn had built around himself, and he realized he had no intention of ever leaving it again. Motion. This novel is not a story of armchair, it's a story in the city and in motion or moving. Quinn experienced and made a story in while he was in motion. Marco Polo's travels. It implies writing should be doing an adventure in the real world, and this novel may be a fantasy. Mystery novels. A reasonable solution to live for Quinn who want to write fine literature. Quinn was fond of mystery novels, because he was interested in not their relation to the world but their relation to other stories in the form of mystery novels. These books were sense of plenitude, and the world of book has possibilities and praised secrets and contradiction of them. And, in the world all of descriptions and words is meaningful. This description signifies the postmodernist literary thought of Paul Auster. At first, this novel and Ghosts were read as a mystery novel by readers and mystery fans. Detective. The detective for Quinn is the person who looks, listens and moves through morass of objects, then pull all these things together and make sense of them. The detective is equal to the writer, carry a meaning other than the simple fact of their being itself. The word private eye for Quinn has triple meanings. The latter two are I is an initial letter of investigator, also I as a first-person singular. The similar notion exists in Auster's next novel Ghosts. A red notebook. Quinn picked a good spiral and standard 8.5 by 11 red notebook with narrow lines and 100 pages in the impressive pile of new notebooks, a beautiful array of blues, greens, reds and yellows. He bought one. It seemed to call out him as it had a destiny hold. The words came from his pen. To write informations, observations and questions about Stillman Sr. in a notebook, made a story, meaning, or a consistency, and Quinn could control the task. This novel is the writings by Quinn on this notebook and the narrator organized and narrates them. The Garden and the Tower, Early Visions of New World, an imaginary book was written by Peter Stillman Sr. Two parts book. The former is titled Myth of Paradise and the latter is The Myth of Babel. The content is an extraordinary, occultist, audacious, deranged and confused theory about the Book of Genesis, the origin of language, the Tower of Babel, the New World and the life of Henry Dark, which justified the foundation of the USA. To invent language. The only work of Adam in the paradise is to invent language. At the time, names and things coincided completely. After the loss of paradise and the fall of men, names became detached from things and words separated into a collection of arbitrary and artificial signs. I think the language theory by Stillman Sr. and its view is contrary to Saussur's semiology and Wittgenstein's language game. Inventing a new language by Stillman Sr. It seems to be like the classical historical linguistic theory to find one ideal language or the thought of Esperanto language. A writer, Auster, has wrote an essay about Don Quixote. The theme is the authorship of the book and who wrote it, how it was written, because Cervantes made effort to readers think he wasn't the author. Auster's inference is the author's is the combination of 4 characters, and the work is an experiment by Don Quixote tested gullibility of people, also he wasn't lunatic, and conducted all from behind. Other key elements in this novel are listed below. Impressive scenes and important descriptions. Impressive scenes and important and interesting descriptions on this novel are listed below. Riddles and questions. Quinn was deceived by the Stillman family, Miss Barber and Mrs. Saavedra. An essay on Don Quixote by writer Auster suggests that Stillman Sr. might act as a lunatic and they tested Quinn, but the riddle can't be solved. Why Quinn was banished? He was involved in Complexity and Enigma of New York and other stories, got mentally and physically sick and lost his existence and reality, so he left from New York and disappeared. Thought and philosophy. In some parts, Auster indicates his literary thought and philosophy of writing. For him the ideal form of novel is practical detective stories as full of meaning and no vainness, and Quinn was interested in the relation among stories and their combinations, and words has no fixed meanings. Stillman Sr. denied the state of language now, he think it was the fall, words and stories should be made by people's activities as writing. On this novel Quinn gathered fragments of things, wrote a red notebook and resulted in constructing his story. I think the Auster's thought of writing is like behalf of Wittgenstein's language game and Sartre's existentialism, also includes the postmodernist theory of deconstruction. It is an active and pragmatic policy of writing put emphasis on physicality, reality and contingency or randomness. The policy resembles the descriptions about an imaginary writer Derek Hartfield on Hear the Wind Sing by Haruki Murakami, his debut novel. Comments, remarks and analysis. A snobbish postmodernist and avant-garde novel contains many signs and elements, fine little episodes and mentions of classic literature. My first impression, I think this novel resembles Auster's next novel Ghosts. Both of them is the story the main character was perplexed, confused and manipulated by a mysterious and confused persons, and the storyline and elements are resemble. This novel is a self-reference novel. Quinn, a writer Paul Auster and the narrator are writers. The characters may reflect Paul Auster himself, and the notion what writing, story and words is an important element in this novel. This novel is an excellent story of stories and writings. The stories in this story splendidly consists this story. I think an outstanding characteristics of Paul Auster's novels is there were many or some impressive, colorful and vivid scenes and interesting, intellectual and integral descriptions and little fine and funny episodes. They calls a harmony and an elaborated image like music, especially like a symphony or a concerto. Almost works of Paul Auster and contemporary novelists of a structure as to seek a riddle or something, or solve a question. Auster do that activity itself on this novel as a symbolic form. This novel has no conclusion and answer. Many riddles and questions remain, so no conclusion is the answer or conclusion. This novel is not an armchair story, is a story in the city and in motion or moving. I think Auster's policy of writing a novel is novels should be written in motion or moving and in the city. The main characters of Auster's novels moved, fought with difficulty, struggled in the real world or a restricted situation, and the stories progress. So it's Auster's practice of language game which was mentioned by Wittgenstein. Also in Auster's novels, characters play their own language games, construct words and stories. I think a sub-theme of this novel is a struggle of the view to words and language between Quinn and Stillman Sr. The former is a contemporary practical language theory like Wittgenstein's language game or the sorcery and semiology. The latter is like the classical historical language study pursues Proto-Indo-European such as Wilhelm von Humboldt and Jacob Grimm.